is the Paula Gordon Show, conversations with people at the leading edge. What a pleasure it is for us, Bill Russell, for me, Paula Gordon, to be with Alan Alda.
Thank you.
You talk about the fact that all of the people in the ensemble that was MASH had been theater trained. And as I was reading both things I overheard while talking to myself and just savoring, because you'd already tempted me with never have your dog stuffed, which is a very funny line to say.
Also a very good idea.
Yes, as you have proven.
I recommend it.
I began to wonder if some of the, forgive my saying, junk that comes out of Hollywood is because it does lack that. Sometimes that there are a lot of people who go to Hollywood and skip that discipline section, which is the theater, the live thing.
Oh.
Don't you think that?
I don't know if
you've done so much of both.
First of all, I don't want to judge what they do in Hollywood. I actually don't watch an awful lot of television anymore. I watch people talking to each other a lot.
That's because you grew up reading the Congressional Record.
I did. It was there in our living room as a decoration, but I read it, and it was the funniest thing I had ever read. I was about 10 years old, and I would be reading the Congressional Record. But I don't think that people avoid the theater because they lack in discipline. I think there aren't that many opportunities. The theater is not as important anymore to the culture as it used to be. There aren't that many theaters around the country, and people go, when they think of Broadway, they think of musicals. The straight play, which is the bedrock of theater, I think, has a very difficult time to survive. So. Even if actors wanted to, it would be hard for them to get into it, but they don't think about it. It's not at the top of the bowl of soup. There's a good image.
I like that. I think it's French onion. I think it must be.
Right. It's the crouton at the top
there we
of the
go.
bowl.
You mentioned the conversation piece, that you watch a lot of conversations or listen to. Somewhere in this your second book, you talk about the importance of action in a performance. If you want to hold people's attention, there has to be action. That action can be mental. It doesn't have to be muscles. It can be mental. But I'm interested because conversations are a very big part of how people get information. We have talk radio all over the place. We have people pontificating night and day on 27 different channels simultaneously on television. And so much of the action, it seems to me, pseudo-action, which is create artificial conflict, yell at one another, but the action is there, the underlying integrity seems to be missing. And I'm curious from your perspective, since you've obviously, this action piece seems to me to be very important. As we communicate with one another, but how do you get what seems to be a fairly quiet, almost passive process, which is two people or three people talking to each other? How do you get action in there and still maintain integrity?
Are you talking about a play or people talking on television?
Yes.
What? Yes. Which one?
Yes.
You have to pick.
Well, let's start with a play.
Well, the thing is, in a way, I agree with your yes. In a way, it does happen the same way in both cases. The thing that I think that the Greek playwrights discovered and that Aristotle figured out and wrote down in the Poetics was the importance of dramatic action, which is not the same thing as a car crash. Obviously, it's somebody wanting something and trying to get it. And somebody else will always want something different and become an obstacle. They don't have to be deliberately in conflict with one another, by the way. All people want what they want. And when one person really tries to get what he or she wants, there's going to be resistance no matter how you set it up. Somebody's always going to want something else. I think when you have people yelling at each other on television about politics, you don't have that because they're doing parallel play. It's almost as though you had a wrestling match, but instead of letting them actually wrestle together. You put them in separate rooms and they're doing calisthenics. I mean, you're just watching people jump up and down all on their own because they don't listen to the other person. They don't. They're not. Their effort is not to have a conversation and get somewhere. Their effort is to sell you their point of view. So it's alternating commercials we're watching for predetermined ideas. Which although I, like a lot of people, I watch that a lot. But it is like watching a fake wrestling match, you know, where they don't mean it. They're just selling.
It's entertainment, not.
Yeah, and it's not very
bad
good entertainment. It's not good,
is
because better entertainment would be where you could believe for a second that somebody is really on an honest quest to get somewhere. It doesn't have it all figured out in advance.
I had that feeling watching West Wing, and I've not seen the whole 7 years, but the sense that one of the things that was accomplished was to break out of this cell mode and get real people to emerge.
Yeah.
And certainly you and all of the characters, it's a wonderful series. All of the characters, but particularly the two who are running for president.
Yeah, Jimmy Smits and my character.
There is this real sense of how do you change the game?
Yeah, well, you know, on the 1 hour live debate that we did, there was a real determined effort on the part of Lawrence O'Donnell, who wrote it, to deliberately break out of the debate format that we tend to see, where it's so routinized that the people can't really talk to one another, and what you get is very much it's a sort of a more polite version of the cable shows, you know, where they feel a little freer to yell at one another, but they still don't listen. So he had my character say at the very beginning, what if we just ditch the usual format and really have a conversation, really discuss this and talk about it. And it was amazing how people around the country responded to that and said over and over again, people come up to me often in airports and say, I wish that that's the way it really was. I wish we could hear a real conversation. I wish we could too. Well, you at least have shown it that can be done. Isn't that what art is supposed to do, is to show us that there are possibilities? There are practical reasons why it isn't done. I mean, the whole thing of negative political advertising, I don't think does the country any good. But you understand how it got that way, and you understand once somebody does it, why they would feel it was suicidal not to do it. When somebody does it against you, you would feel that you would have to do it back. But so no amount of art is going to change that, I don't think.
It's interesting. I found myself watching West Wing in the middle of a political campaign and thinking, we tend to think that art is it's entertainment, but it really doesn't have much to do with the lives we live, which you make a compelling argument is is a fairly parochial and probably diminished view of what art can do. But it seemed to me that the campaign this year, the last 2 years,
2007 and 8,
would not be as it were had there not been this extraordinarily programmed broadcast over several seasons that exemplified the kinds of things you're talking about, the kinds of conversations that people can have. There was at least this model out there that was different from what we've been experiencing, and I don't mean to say it changed the entire debate, but it seems to, change happens at the margins typically, and it seems that having that model out there, having experienced people doing the kinds of things you were talking about.
And it was broadcast, not cablecast, so that at least the possibility of a larger audience was there.
You may be right, but I'm very reluctant to think that a television show has that kind of impact. It could be. It could be that the people were ready to see that, and that's why it was able to be written.
And it's also possible.
It might work the other way around.
Well, I think it probably is. Yeah. I think there was probably. I mean, my hope is that there's some kind of a dialogue. I mean, a good writer attends to the audience. You can't ignore the audience.
But I just, as you can imagine, I shrink from getting
want that responsibility.
too high-flown an idea of what we contribute. I think basically what we contribute is some kind of refreshment, not just passing the time, but refreshing the people who watch it at its best. Because if you can hit somebody's reset button with a piece of art, I think you've done an enormous good for them, and I put it in those very general terms because I don't think we really know what art does to people, and whether it's so-called low art or so-called high art, and I'm not so happy about those distinctions.
Before we go to a break and come back, part of what I'm thinking as you're saying these things is how important it has been over the last couple of decades in things like television, and certainly in things that are much more possible to be candid and not feel violated. You didn't write reality television in your books, and you did reflect a certain reality. I have a number of friends now who are actively writing, have just written, are following your idea of writing about mental health issues. And your willingness to say, you know, there's serious mental health and mental illness issues in my family, in my life, in my experience.
Oh, my mother was psychotic, but yeah, you know, it's funny. People said, "Oh, were you worried about writing about that, or was it difficult to write about?" No, it wasn't at all difficult, and I didn't feel I was exposing something private. I think there's a difference between private and personal. You know, I think you have to be personal in art. You have, especially in the thing I do, writing and acting. If it's not personal, it's just mechanical. So that you have to sense that there's a person behind the words. But that doesn't mean you have to tell private things that's nobody's business. And I don't mind people knowing my mother was psychotic. In fact, I think it might help somebody else to know. It helped me to know, for instance, when I talked to a scientist, to try to get some insight just biologically into my mother's problems when I was writing about it in this book. It turned out that his brother was schizophrenic, just as my mother had been, and he went into his area of science in order to find the gene that was associated with schizophrenia. But he told me such personal stories about his having idolized his brother, and now it being so painful for him to visit his brother in the hospital and that kind of thing. It touched me, and I realized that I was helped by his personal accounting of that. But he didn't tell me anything that was too private to tell, but it was very personal, and it helped me. And I don't mind at all relating my experience, because it's a human experience, you know. When we talk about wanting to accomplish something and something's obstructing it, and that's what makes it a play. When you're a kid and your mother is psychotic, that's dramatic. It's not dramatic because it's cataclysmic, and it is cataclysmic. But because that's something you have to get through. You have to find the person behind the psychosis. And I realized years later that she loved me very much. And she actually gave me a lot of strength and courage because she loved me. And that had to come through the psychosis. And to realize that such a thing can happen is amazing, because it's annoying to live with somebody who's not mentally stable. But when you realize that in spite of that annoying quality, they are able to love you and you're able to benefit from it, that's a release. You know, you feel much better when you realize that.
You've just given me a gift thinking about my mother who was depressed. So these things really, well, and it's good to know that
depressed. I mean, all the time.
Pretty depressed.
Yeah.
And to know that other people share these experiences, and you can find beauty behind these things.
I don't think it's good to. It's not good to ignore the fact that it's hard to live with somebody like that. You know, but it's also good to realize that it's like a fog through which once in a while the person peeks through, and that's worth capturing.
And Alan Alda does that. He does that both in Things I Overheard While Talking to Myself and in Never Have Your Dog Stuffed, which is a very good idea. Be with us when we return with more good ideas from Alan Alda.